Thanks, Paul, and thanks very much to the Immunisation Coalition for the invitation to speak today. So definitely a little bit of a different topic, and the title of this session included Tools to Drive Vaccination. And I guess I'm really going to talk a little bit about vaccine development, product development, and the entire value chain, and I'll explain what I mean by that, and in particular some of the challenges that we're facing in the Australian ecosystem. So I'd like to pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people that are here today or joining us online, and their elders past, present and emerging. And I have too many conflicts of interest to declare because BioIntellect works across the entire ecosystem. We work for universities, research institutes, state government, federal government, small biotech companies, large biotech companies. And that was one of the reasons that we saw an opportunity to pull this value chain conference together. So we had this conference a few weeks ago in May in Sydney, and it was an invitation-only conference with 220 people, and they came from all parts of the ecosystem, pretty much the groups I've just described, and we had a very well-balanced audience. And the idea was to get senior decision makers from the ecosystem together to discuss through the entire value chain some of the challenges and opportunities that we face in Australia. So what do we mean by the value chain? Well, this was a concept developed years ago by Porter, and the definition broadly means activities that create value. And of course, we're all here because we're passionate about reducing the impact of vaccine-preventable diseases. You can't do that without vaccines. So in the context of vaccines, the value chain is really all the activities that add value from the discovery of a new vaccine candidate through to you guys having a vaccine available that you can implement at the population level. You can see here on this slide the organising committee that we had for the conference, and again, a diverse group of people that come from ex-regulatory public health folks, as well as basic researchers and industry people, both from major pharmaceutical companies and small biotech. This here is a copy of the conference brochure. If anyone's interested in knowing a bit more about it, you can email us at events@biointellect.com and we'll be able to provide an electronic copy of that brochure. So the agenda, the objective really was to walk through the value chain. So we started with the value chain, what is it? What do we want for Australia? We then looked at preclinical vaccine development, clinical trials, manufacturing and supply, enabling policy and regulation. We had a special session entitled How can Australia contribute to CEPI's 100-day mission and the Regional Vaccine Manufacturing Collaborative? And this was sponsored by CEPI. And then we moved on to the topics that have been discussed this week at CDIC and Immunisation Coalition, equity of access and uptake, market access and health technology assessment, funding and investment, and then bringing it all together. So that's the agenda that you can see. I also presented at the conference some work to try and get an idea of what the Australian value chain looks like. So firstly, I'm going to talk about the global pipeline for vaccines. And this is a fantastic report that was released at the beginning of the year from BIO, which is the industry association in the US. And it's the state of innovation in infectious disease vaccines and prophylactic antibodies. And it looks at the global pipeline of products that are in development. And what you can see on the right-hand side, there are 249 vaccine candidates that are in clinical stage development. And you can see the split there of viruses, bacteria, parasites, and combination vaccines. And today we have 34 unique pathogens which are covered by a licensed and approved vaccine. We have 15 different vaccine modalities. And by that, I mean DNA, RNA, protein, recombinant, live attenuated. And we have 31 infectious diseases in the clinical pipeline for which there's no currently available vaccine approved today. So still some work to do to develop new vaccines. This report also looked worryingly at the state of funding and the private equity and venture capital that is available for companies to raise. And it's comparing the money raised in purple for oncology products and the money in orange, that's for infectious disease products. So you can see that we have a real challenge in infectious diseases to actually attract the funding and the investment that's needed to develop new products. Now, one of the things my team tried to do was to try and quantify the funding that was available in Australia for developing infectious disease vaccines, and we couldn't. And we couldn't because you can't collect the right data fields in the grant funding systems. And it's basically too fragmented and hard to quantify. So that's an interesting lesson to learn, that we don't really know. We can identify vaccine funding towards infectious diseases broadly, but not to product development in vaccines. We then tried to have a look at the Australian value chain, and I'm old enough to remember the CRC for vaccine technology, which many of you will know was disbanded, I think, in 2004. And so what we tried to do is say, well, let's look at the last 20 odd years of vaccine research in Australia and say, well, what have we invented? What have we managed to do with our research funding? And what we found is we found 642 patents. And so these are Australian patents, Australian inventions filed for vaccine candidates or technologies for an infectious disease, a preventative vaccine. So we're not including peanut vaccines or cancer vaccines. It's only infectious diseases. What we then tried to do is track the development of those, and we can't. Again, we don't have the data. So we found that 524 grants had been awarded to people that were working on a vaccine candidate, but it's not a subset of 642 patents. So it's a completely different data set. So it doesn't represent any transition along the value chain. And similarly, when we looked at clinical trials, we found 130 clinical trials done over the last 20 years for vaccine candidates against infectious disease targets. And I'll go a little bit more into detail, but again, it's a different data set. It's not a subset of the 524. So our goal was to look at that pipeline of the funnel from discovery through to market and see how we progress, but the take-home message is that we don't have the data to measure that. Now, the one on the right, NIP inclusion, is Gardasil. I'm sure people may debate whether that was a wholly Australian invention or not, but we thought we would put that in as the one vaccine that's got all the way through to market. And as you probably know, there's a nice NHMRC case study on that vaccine. What we were hoping to show, and absolutely couldn't, was also the probability of success and the transition for each stage of development, which is well quantified globally, but we can't do that with Australian research. Now, this is the sort of breakdown of the data set of the 524 projects that were funded with grant funding. And what you can see there that of the top 15 infectious disease targets, that got 45% of the funding. So a total of 642 million awarded since 2000 for infectious disease vaccines. And you can see the little dots there to show the major amounts of funding for the top 15 infectious disease targets. And of course, what's interesting about that is that Australian research does also focus on diseases which are not endemic in Australia, which means the research we're doing here is really important for low and middle income countries and for the region. So now clinical trials. This is a great graph. We've looked at the number of clinical trials with an intervention, a vaccine intervention, since 2000. So you can see there were 2 in 2000 right through to about 2028 in 2023. And you can see the massive growth in clinical trial activity for vaccines. Now, the color coding, the orange is representing international sponsors operating in Australia and doing their clinical trials here. So that would include multinational companies like GSK or Pfizer, and it would also include companies like Novavax. We did include Securus as a local company, and all the local sponsors are in the purple shades of color. But the challenge with this data set, so of the total number of trials, 37% are with an Australian sponsor, and that's the 130 that you saw on the previous slide, is it could be anything. It could be a duration of immunity study by a research institute. It doesn't necessarily represent the development of a new vaccine. And again, we don't have the data to break that down unless you do it manually through clinicaltrials.gov. This is the same data set split by disease target. And again, you can see the top 15, and no surprise that COVID's an outlier on the left. And what's also interesting is that the different proportions of international and local varies by target, and no surprise when there are new vaccines coming like RSV, there's a dominance of international sponsors compared to local studies. But again, remember, the local studies will include investigator-initiated studies, and although they have an intervention, they may not be new product development. So then what we did is we did a survey. Now, for the Value Chain Conference, we actually invited about 370 people, 220 people came. So we looked at that and the people we'd found in the patent database, and we sent out an email to 300 vaccine researchers in Australia to ask them if they would fill in a survey on their experience of vaccine development. We had a response rate of 10%, so it's a pretty small data set, 30 people responded. And what you can see here is a split of vaccine candidates that people were working on. Were they viral, bacterial, or for a parasite? Did they involve collaboration with an industry, a partner, or not? And then we also tried to gauge the stage of development. And you may or may not be familiar with this technology readiness scale, which is used to measure development. And I'm going to come back to that. But basically, the TRL describes the stage of development that you're at. And once you get up to TRL 6, you're in the clinic. 7, you're getting into the clinic. So it really gives you a way of quantifying the stage of development of the vaccine. So you can also see there the split of the different stages of development of the vaccines from the survey respondents. We also asked people to sort of quantify some of the things that had contributed to success of their product development and also things that were a barrier. And probably no surprise, funding was number one. Excuse me. Funding was at the top, as well as the composition of the team, the ability to collaborate with industry, and access to facilities and expertise. Now, anyone that would like to contribute to the survey, we're going to continue this work because obviously this data set's very small. And we've also had some nice offers to work with NHMRC, Department of Health, to see if we can do a bit more data mining to try and quantify what we were trying to do a bit better. But the take-home message really is that we need better data to measure commercialization and translation. So if you look at the middle of this graph, we have, I guess, the vaccine value chain from basic research all the way through to post-market real-world evidence that I've just described. And what we'd like to propose is that we actually need a framework to measure commercialization and translation, because if we don't measure what we do, how can we improve at it? And we are proposing that Australia should adopt the technology readiness level framework. This is actually used by NIH, by FDA, by BARDA, and it has very well described levels for all the TRLs to see what stage of development the product is at. And so what that means is we could deploy grant funding to develop new vaccines where actually people are accountable, for example, to move from TRL 6 to TRL 7 and get their vaccine into the clinic. There is a nice publication by WHO looking at the full value of vaccine assessments, and it does describe the hurdles in vaccine development. But the challenge with the publication is, again, it doesn't really define specific levels that you can quantify the stage of development of the vaccine. It more describes the overall value framework and the different hurdles. So if we think about the other end of the value chain, one of the things we wanted to explore at the conference is what drives industry and the private sector to make investment decisions. And we need to understand that the other end of the value chain really is the market size and the incentives that there are for the private sector to operate, commercialise and invest in Australia. So the vaccine market in Australia is estimated at in the order of $650 to $700 million. And the large proportion of that is the National Immunisation Programme. There's obviously a private market of about 120 million. And then from time to time, investments in the National Medicine Stockpile. That's how the COVID vaccines were funded. And as you'd appreciate, that's typically event-driven, so difficult to quantify. And we had some great discussions at the conference about other jurisdictions such as Singapore that have significant incentives for companies to establish manufacturing facilities. And I guess the take-home message here is that we have the Department of Industry now funding the National Reconstruction Fund with a great opportunity to invest in advanced manufacturing capability in Australia. But we need to recognise with 24 million, we're a small population, we're a small market. And if we're going to invest in manufacturing, we need to think about regional supply, and we need to think about the right incentives to attract industry and the right skilled workforce to operate these facilities, because we don't have enough people in the country to achieve that goal of sovereign capability with the right skill sets. So what we're in the process of doing now is writing up from the conference, and this slide's very draft, some of the outcomes and recommendations. And what became very clear is that for product development, we need a national approach, whether that's national clinical trial networks or product development partnerships. If we want to attract overseas investment, we need to be talking about Team Australia and not fighting at institutional or jurisdictional level. We need to invest in prevention. That market size I just showed you is less than 5% of the total spend on pharmaceuticals. So we need to invest in prevention, recognize the full value of vaccines, and recognize the drivers of investment for the private sector. And then, of course, we need the enabling policy and regulatory pathways. And I won't talk about number 4 because that's been done very eloquently by many people before me already as part of this conference. Thanks very much.